He didn't even wait until midnight. Cordelia Moretti had been married exactly 4 hours and 17 minutes. She sat alone in the presidential bridal suite at the Fairmont Copley Plaza. She was still wearing a dress that cost more than most people's cars. She listened to the silence of a room meant for two. Her champagne had gone flat. The roses were still perfect, and the bed hadn't been touched. The man who had kissed her in front of 400 guests and promised her forever was somewhere in this same city, in someone else's arms. She didn't cry. Not yet. She just sat there by the window, watching the Boston skyline like it owed her an explanation. She asked herself the question that would change everything. What kind of woman do I want to be when I walk out of this room? If you have ever loved someone completely and trusted them with the version of yourself nobody else gets to see, you know the feeling. If you then discovered that trust was just a tool they used against you, then you already know what Cordelia felt in that moment. You already know exactly what she decided. Now let's go back to the beginning. Because to understand what Cordelia did, you have to understand everything she survived to get there. Cordelia Ashford had never been the kind of woman who needed saving. That was the first thing people got wrong about her. They saw the quiet voice, the careful way she chose her words, the habit she had of listening more than she spoke. And they mistook all of that for weakness. Her own mother had done it. Half the women in her social circle had done it. And eventually, Dante Moretti had done it too. That mistake would cost him everything. But on the morning of her wedding, none of that was visible yet. On the morning of her wedding, Cordelia was 31 years old. She was standing in front of a full-length mirror inside a suite at the Fairmont, and she was genuinely, uncomplicatedly happy. Not the kind of happy that needs convincing. The real kind. The embarrassing kind that makes you smile at nothing while your maid of honor is trying to pin your veil straight. "Hold still," said Marisol. She had been Cordelia's best friend since they were 19 and accidentally enrolled in the same art history lecture. Marisol had opinions about everything, and she kept most of them to herself until exactly the moment they became necessary. "If I stab you with this pin, it's your fault. You've been saying that for 20 minutes. Because you keep moving." Marisol stepped back and looked at her. It was the particular expression reserved for things she found beautiful and would never admit out loud. "Okay, fine. You look disgustingly good." Cordelia turned to face the mirror properly, and for a moment she just looked. The dress was ivory silk, clean lines, nothing overdone. Dante had offered to buy her anything. Anything he'd said, like the word had no ceiling. She'd chosen something simple. That should have told her something about herself. It should have told her about the distance between who she actually was and the world she was walking into. But she hadn't been thinking about that. She'd been thinking about Dante's face, the first time he saw her across a museum gala 3 years ago. She thought about the way he'd crossed the entire room. Like the other 200 people in it simply didn't register. She'd been thinking about the Sunday mornings when he made coffee badly and didn't apologize for it. She thought about the argument they'd had over nothing last February that ended with both of them laughing so hard she'd had to sit down on the kitchen floor. She'd been thinking she was lucky. "You nervous?" Marisol asked. "No," Cordelia said. Then she added, "Honestly a little. That's normal, is it? I keep feeling like I forgot something." Marisol zipped up a makeup bag with a sharp snap. "You forgot nothing. You have the rings, I have the backup rings, and the florist confirmed twice. Your father has been in the lobby for 40 minutes already. That means he's on his 3rd scotch, and will cry exactly once during the ceremony and blame allergies." Cordelia laughed, despite herself. "That's accurate. I know it's accurate. I've been watching your family for 12 years. Marisol handed her the bouquet. It was white peonies and something small and green she'd specifically asked for, but whose name she could never remember. Marisol looked at her seriously for just a moment. "He loves you, you know, Dante. I've seen the way he looks at you." Cordelia nodded. She believed it then. She genuinely did. Dante Moretti was not a man who made entrances. He didn't need to. He was the kind of person whose presence rearranged a room before he'd said a single word. It was something about the way he stood, the absolute stillness of him. He never seemed to be looking for anything because he'd already assessed everything and found it satisfactory or insufficient. He was 53 years old, silver at the temples, with dark eyes that gave away nothing unless he wanted them to. He had a jaw that looked like it had been constructed specifically to hold difficult expressions with authority. He wore the wedding suit like he'd been born in it. That was because Dante Moretti wore everything, like it had been designed for him personally, and not the other way around. His best man was a thick-necked man named Frank Calabrese. He had been with Dante for 18 years and once described himself as a business facilitator. Frank nudged him as the music began. "You ready?" Dante straightened his cuffs. One, then the other. It was a habit. "I've been ready." "You look ready," Frank said, which was the closest he ever got to complimenting anyone. What neither of them said, what sat in the space between them like a third person, was the phone call that had come in 3 hours earlier. A call from a woman named Elena Vasquez, who was 38, who worked in the art department of a private auction house in New York, and who had been Dante Moretti's secret for going on 4 years. Elena had called to say she understood that she would wait. She said she knew what this marriage was. It was a shield, a strategic repositioning. It was a way to make a crime empire look like a respectable family concern during a period of federal attention. She said she wasn't angry. Dante had told her she was patient, and he appreciated it. Then he'd hung up, straightened his cuffs, and walked down the aisle toward Cordelia with his eyes fixed on her face, like she was the only thing in the room. And here's the thing about Dante Moretti that made him genuinely dangerous, in ways that had nothing to do with the men who worked for him, or the reach of his influence, or the judges who returned his calls. He was capable of compartmentalizing so completely that he could look at Cordelia Ashford in that moment and feel something real. Not guilt, not performance. Something that actually functioned like love. Because Dante had trained himself over 20 years to access whichever feeling was useful in whichever moment he was standing in. He held her hands at the altar and meant every word. That was the cruelest part. The reception was at the Mandarin Oriental, and it was the kind of event that gets described in whispered terms afterward. The food, the flowers, the string quartet that transitioned to a jazz trio at exactly 10 o'clock. 400 people, almost none of whom Cordelia actually knew well, filling the room with noise and champagne. It was the particular performance of celebration that the very rich have perfected. Cordelia danced with her father, who did in fact cry exactly once, and did in fact blame allergies. She danced with Dante, and he held her like she mattered. She put her face against his shoulder for a moment and breathed in the clean smell of his jacket. She thought, "This is real. This is mine. I'm not going to spend our wedding night being afraid of the parts of him I don't understand." She'd known, always in some version of knowing that lives in the stomach rather than the mind, that Dante's business was not the kind that got discussed at dinner. She'd known there were phone calls he took in other rooms, men who appeared and disappeared, envelopes that moved between hands at events she wasn't invited to. She'd told herself she loved the man, not the machinery. She'd told herself that whatever he was in that world, he was something different with her. At 11:15, Dante kissed her forehead and said, "Sal is in trouble. I've got to handle something." Sal was one of his captains, Salvatore D'Amico, who had a scar through his left eyebrow and a tendency to create problems at inconvenient times. Tonight, Cordelia said, "It won't take long. Go upstairs. I'll be there in an hour." She looked at him for a moment, not suspicious, not yet. Just searching his face the way you do when you're trying to decide whether to push. And he kissed her again, this time on the mouth, warm and certain, and she decided not to push. 1 hour, she said. 1 hour, he said. He was lying, and he knew it. Some part of him, not enough of a part, but some, felt the weight of that as he walked away from her. He walked through the crowd of 400 people who were applauding his wedding, while he was already leaving it. Cordelia waited. 1 hour became 2. 2 became 3. She changed out of the wedding dress, carefully, hanging it on the back of the closet door because she didn't know what else to do with it. She ordered room service she didn't eat. She turned on the television and turned it off again. She sat by the window in a robe and watched the city and told herself there were 100 reasonable explanations. By 2 in the morning, she'd stopped telling herself anything. She was reaching for her phone to call him when she noticed his tablet on the nightstand. He'd left it there before the ceremony. It was a small carelessness, unlike him. The kind that happens when someone is managing too many things at once and doesn't think their wife is a threat. She didn't mean to look at it. That is the truth. Though she would later understand that the difference between meaning and doing is smaller than people like to believe. The screen lit when she picked it up. She'd been going to plug it in, that was all. But the message thread was already open. It had been open when he put it down, and the name at the top was the letter E. Just the single letter, no last name, no explanation. And the most recent message, sent at 11:45 minutes after Dante had kissed her forehead and told her Sal was in trouble, read, "Just got here. The suite is perfect. I missed you." Cordelia read it once. Then she read the message above it, which was Dante's response sent at 11:30, leaving in 15 minutes. "Tell them we'll want the late breakfast." Then she read the one above that, from the letter E, sent at 10 o'clock that night, while Cordelia and Dante had been dancing. "I keep thinking about what you said, that this changes nothing between us. Do you mean that?" And Dante's response, sent from the bathroom of his own wedding reception. "I mean it. This is business. You're not business." Cordelia set the tablet down on the nightstand very carefully. She sat with her hands in her lap and did not move for a long time. There is a thing that happens in moments of real shock, not movie shock, not the kind with tears and thrown objects, but the real kind. The kind where everything becomes extraordinarily quiet, not peaceful, just quiet, the way a room gets quiet when all the sound has been replaced by something that has no name. She sat in that quiet, and then slowly she picked the tablet back up, because Cordelia Moretti, now legally, as of 6 hours ago, had a mind that worked like a very precise instrument. That instrument had just been given a problem to solve, and solving problems was one of the things she did better than almost anyone. She scrolled. She didn't rush. She went methodically backward through the thread, reading carefully. What she found was not what breaks you. What she found was something worse than heartbreak. It was worse because it was so organized, so deliberate, so free of ambiguity. She found 4 years of a parallel life. She found Elena, a name that appeared in earlier messages before Dante had become cautious enough to reduce her to a single letter. Elena Vasquez. She found the cadence of their relationship, the inside jokes, the way Dante wrote to this woman with the looseness he never quite used with Cordelia. He did this because Elena didn't need to be managed. Elena was the one he didn't perform for. She found a message from 14 months ago in which Elena had asked directly, "If you could just leave the business side of things behind, would you? Or is it always going to be one thing or another?" And Dante had written back, "The marriage is strategy. Ashford's family has connections I need right now, and a public wedding cleans up the narrative. 2 years, maybe 3. Then we figure out something different. You know you're not optional." Cordelia read that 3 times. The marriage is strategy. She turned the tablet off. She stood up from the bed and walked to the window. Boston was still out there, indifferent. Beautiful in the way that cities are beautiful at 3 in the morning when you are the only person awake enough to see them. She thought about crying. The impulse was there, real and present. She'd loved this man. She had genuinely, completely loved him. That wasn't nothing. That wasn't a small thing to discover had been used. But underneath the grief, deeper than it, quieter, something else was already moving. Cordelia pressed one hand flat against the cold glass of the window. 2 years, maybe 3. She was thinking about access. She was thinking about the joint accounts Dante had set up because it made the marriage look real. A wife who had no access to her husband's finances would raise questions. She was thinking about the files she'd seen him reference. The organizational structures he'd walked her through in a moment of careless confidence. She thought about the names and numbers and offshore arrangements that existed as far as Dante was concerned, in a world she would never understand or interfere with. He had made her a Moretti. He had no idea what he'd handed her when he did it. She was not going to cry tonight. There would be time for that later, somewhere else, somewhere safe. Right now, she had something more useful to do with the electricity moving through her. This cold, clarifying current that was partly grief, and partly fury, and partly something she would only later be able to identify accurately. It was the feeling of a woman who has just realized she is not, in fact, the person in this situation without power. She picked up her phone not to call Dante. Not yet, maybe not ever. She called Marisol. It rang twice. Cor? It's 3 in the morning. I know. Cordelia's voice was steady. She was surprised by that. I need you to do something for me. Marisol, who had known Cordelia for 12 years and had never once heard her call at 3 in the morning, said very carefully, What happened? I'll explain everything, but first I need to know. Your cousin, the one who does financial forensics, is she still at the firm in Hartford? Silence. Then Cordelia. What happened? He didn't come upstairs, Cordelia said. Simple, factual, and I found out why. The sound of Marisol sitting up in bed. Oh, honey, I'm not calling to cry, Mari. And her voice didn't crack, which surprised her again. I'm calling because I have 7 days before he expects me to have figured out that everything is fine. I need help understanding some financial structures that are considerably more complicated than anything I've dealt with before. A very long pause. When Marisol spoke again, her voice had changed into something quieter and more focused. My cousin's name is Patricia. I'll have her number for you by 8 a.m. Thank you. Cordelia. Yeah, are you okay? Cordelia looked at the wedding dress hanging on the closet door. The silk caught the light from the city outside, and for a moment it looked almost ghostly. This beautiful, expensive, unnecessary thing. I'm going to be, she said. She meant it differently than she would have meant it an hour ago. An hour ago, going to be okay meant surviving the grief of a betrayal. Now it meant something considerably more precise. She hung up. She sat down at the desk by the window. She opened her laptop. Cordelia Moretti, who had been Cordelia Ashford until 6 hours ago, who had been quiet and careful and easy to underestimate her entire life, who had spent 3 years loving a man who had calculated exactly what she was worth to him in a strategy document, began to make a plan. Outside, the city breathed its 3 a.m. breath, indifferent and beautiful. She had 7 days. She intended to use every one of them. The alarm on Cordelia's phone went off at 6:30 in the morning, and for exactly 3 seconds after she opened her eyes, she forgot. 3 seconds of ordinary morning, the pale light coming through the curtains, the distant sound of the city below, the feeling of a bed that was too large and too quiet. And then it came back, not gradually, but all at once, the way a wave doesn't announce itself until it's already knocked you sideways. She lay there and let it land. Then she got up. That was the thing about Cordelia that Dante had never quite understood. Even in the 3 years he'd spent close enough to her to see it clearly, she didn't process and then act. She acted first and processed in the space between actions, like someone who has learned that standing still in the middle of a current is the fastest way to drown. She showered. She dressed in the clothes she'd packed for the first morning of what was supposed to be a honeymoon week at the hotel before they flew to Positano on Thursday. Dark trousers, a gray blouse. Nothing that announced itself. She ordered coffee from room service and drank it standing at the window because she didn't trust herself to sit still yet. At 8:04, Marisol sent Patricia's number with a single text beneath it. She knows to expect your call. I told her it was urgent. I didn't tell her anything else because it's not my story to tell. Cordelia stared at that last sentence for a moment. Then she called Patricia. Patricia Reyes had a voice like someone who had delivered difficult information so many times that the difficulty itself had become a texture she moved through without registering it. She was businesslike without being cold, specific without being patronizing. Within the first 4 minutes of the call, she had asked Cordelia 3 questions that made it clear she understood exactly what kind of situation she was dealing with. When you say joint accounts, Patricia said, do you have documentation of the account numbers, the associated entities, or just the login credentials? I have credentials for 6 accounts, Cordelia said. How much time do you have access to these accounts before the situation changes? 7 days, Cordelia told her. Maybe less if he gets careless about checking in. And what is your goal? Asset protection? Documentation for legal purposes? Both? By the end of the call, she had a list of 12 things to do before noon. She also had a clearer picture of the financial architecture Dante had built over 20 years than she'd ever expected to acquire. Patricia had explained it the way a doctor explains a scan, without flinching, without softening, naming each structure by what it actually was and not what it was designed to look like. The marriage, as Patricia put it, had been unusually generous with access rights, which is either a sign of real trust or a sign that whoever set it up never expected the trust to be tested. It was real trust, Cordelia said. He just trusted the wrong version of me. Patricia didn't respond to that, which was the right call. Dante came back to the hotel at 9:47 in the morning. Cordelia knew the exact time because she was sitting at the desk when she heard the key card. She looked at her phone out of reflex before she looked at the door. She had 40 seconds to put the laptop to sleep, move a coffee cup from one side of the desk to the other for no reason, and pick up the novel she'd been pretending to read for the last 3 days. He walked in looking like someone who had showered somewhere else. Hair damp, fresh shirt. The suit jacket he'd been wearing when he left last night was folded over his arm. "Hey," he said. "Hey," she said. He crossed the room and kissed the top of her head. She let him. She kept her eyes on the page. "Sal's situation took longer than I thought." "It usually does," she said. The tone was neutral. She'd practiced neutral for the last 4 hours. He sat on the edge of the bed, and she could feel him looking at her, doing the thing he always did when he was assessing a room. He was reading it for tension, checking for things out of place. His eyes moved to the desk, to the laptop, to her coffee cup. "You sleep?" he asked. "Some." She turned a page she hadn't read. "You hungry?" "I was going to order breakfast." He relaxed. She watched it happen in her peripheral vision. The slight drop in his shoulders, the recalibration of his attention away from concern and toward routine. She had given him the right answer, the answer of a woman who had spent a restless night alone and had decided to be a good sport about it. "Yeah," he said, "order me whatever you're having." She picked up the hotel phone and ordered eggs and toast and more coffee, and her voice was the same voice it always was. And when she set the phone down, he was already looking at his own phone, already back inside the machinery of his actual life. She watched him for exactly 1 second. Then she went back to her fake book. "You trusted the wrong version of me," she thought. "That was your first mistake. I'm going to make sure it's also your last." The next 6 days had a structure that nobody except Cordelia would have recognized as a structure. On the surface, they were a honeymoon week that had lost its momentum. Dante working half the day, Cordelia touring the city alone or with Marisol, who drove up from Providence on day 2 without being asked, which was the kind of thing Marisol did. They had dinner together each evening, Dante and Cordelia, and the dinners were not bad. Dante was charming at dinner. He asked questions and remembered her answers. He laughed at the right moments. He was, in the specific context of a restaurant table with good wine, a man who knew how to make a woman feel seen. Cordelia ate her food and said the right things, and came home each night and opened her laptop. The financial work was meticulous and took longer than Patricia had initially estimated. Patricia told her this without apology on the evening of day 2. These structures are layered in ways that suggest the person who built them had help from people who are very good at what they do. I want to make sure we understand what we're touching before we touch it. "I understand," Cordelia said. "You understand legally, or you understand because you want to be careful?" "Both, but mostly the second one." She paused. "I don't want to do anything that creates a problem for me later. I want everything I do to be defensible." "Good," Patricia said. "That's the right instinct." What Patricia was helping her do was not theft exactly. The joint accounts had been set up, at Dante's instruction, through Dante's lawyers, with both names equally on every document. Every transfer Cordelia made was technically legal, which was either an oversight on Dante's part or a consequence of the particular kind of arrogance that assumes a thing can't be used against you because it belongs to you. By the morning of day 3, she had moved $4.2 million from 2 joint accounts into a protected trust that Patricia had set up under Cordelia's maiden name. She'd done it in increments through a routing path that Patricia designed to look like a series of legitimate investment transfers. The kind of thing wealthy people do without explanation, because wealthy people do not expect to be asked for explanations. On the same afternoon, day 3, Dante had lunch with Frank Calabrese at a restaurant on Newberry Street. Cordelia knew this because she had started paying attention in ways she never had before. And paying attention, it turned out, was mostly just a matter of deciding to. She walked past the restaurant on a route that could not have been planned. She was on her way to the Gardner Museum, which was true, and through the window she saw them. Dante and Frank's heads were close together over the table. Frank's thick hands moving in the particular way they moved when he was telling Dante something he hadn't said out loud yet. She kept walking. She didn't slow down. She didn't look back. She walked to the Gardner Museum and stood in front of a Vermeer for 20 minutes. And if anyone had been watching, they would have seen a woman in a gray coat looking at a painting. They would not have seen a woman taking inventory. The phone call happened on day 4, and it was not something she planned. She was in the hotel elevator at 4:15 in the afternoon. She was coming back from a meeting with Patricia's colleague, a document specialist, a precise woman named Gwen, who wore reading glasses on a chain and had the energy of someone who has never had a single unnecessary thought. And her phone rang with a number she didn't recognize. She almost didn't answer it. She answered it. Mrs. Moretti, a woman's voice, composed but with something underneath it. I think we should talk. Cordelia pressed the button for her floor. Who is this? My name is Elena Vasquez. The elevator doors opened. Cordelia stepped out into the hallway and stood there without moving for a moment. How did you get this number? She asked. Dante's assistant has it listed for hotel emergencies. I told her I was the hotel florist with the delivery question. A beat. I'm not the hotel florist. No, Cordelia said. I know who you are. Silence from Elena's end, then differently. You know, I know. Another silence, longer. When Elena spoke again, the composure had shifted into something raw, less rehearsed. Then why are you still there? It was a strange question, not accusatory, not defensive. Genuinely confused. The way people get confused when a situation refuses to behave according to the logic they've applied to it. Cordelia walked to her door and let herself in, and she stood by the window because that was apparently where she processed things now. I'm still here because I have things to finish, she said. What kind of things? The kind that require me to be in the same city for a few more days. She kept her voice even. What is it you wanted to say, Elena? More silence. Then I wanted to say I'm sorry. I know that's not worth much. Cordelia considered this. She was not, in this moment, particularly interested in Elena Vasquez's apology. What she was interested in was information, and Elena was a source of it. Were you with him last Thursday, the night of the wedding? A breath. Yes. Where? The Elliott, off Commonwealth. Cordelia nodded, even though no one could see her. The Elliott, 4 miles from the Fairmont. He'd been 4 miles away. How long have you been together? 4 years. Elena said, almost exactly. Did you know about me before the wedding? I knew about the wedding, Elena said, which was not quite the same answer, and they both understood that. I knew what he said it was. Strategy, Cordelia said. Elena made a sound that was half breath, half something else. He said it like that made it not real. Like because it was practical, it was also not a betrayal of anything. And what did you think? Honestly? Elena's voice went quieter. I thought I was the one being betrayed by both of you. Because he used me as the reason it didn't count, and he used you as the reason it didn't last. And neither of us got to be the actual person in the situation. Cordelia stood very still. She had not expected that. She had expected, if she was being honest, some version of defensiveness or apology or calculation. She had not expected accuracy. You're right, Cordelia said after a moment. I'm also done, Elena said. I want you to know that. Whatever happens, I'm not waiting for him anymore. Okay. I just needed to say it to someone who would understand why it matters. Cordelia almost said something that would have been kind. She stopped herself because kindness in this particular moment would have required her to step outside the thing she was building, and she couldn't afford to do that. Not yet. I understand why it matters, she said instead. Take care of yourself. She hung up. She sat down on the floor, not the bed, the floor, for no reason she could explain. And she breathed for a minute, just breathed. Elena Vasquez had loved the same man she loved, and had been used in a different way for a different purpose. And the only thing she'd gotten out of 4 years of it was the right to say she was done. Cordelia got up off the floor. She opened her laptop. She went back to work. Day 5 was when Frank Calabrese came to find her. She was in the hotel lobby, waiting for Marisol, when she saw him come through the main entrance wearing his usual expression, the one that sat somewhere between assessing and unimpressed. It suggested that he'd seen too much of everything to have strong feelings about any particular piece of it. He spotted her immediately, which meant he'd been looking. Mrs. Moretti. He said it the way people say words they've recently been instructed to use. "You got a minute?" "I'm meeting someone in 10 minutes, Cordelia said. "This won't take 10. He nodded toward the far side of the lobby, away from the front desk, and she followed him because not following would have been more complicated than it was worth. He stopped by a cluster of chairs that no one was using. He didn't sit, neither did she. "I'm going to be straight with you," Frank said, which was either a good sign or the kind of thing someone says right before they're not straight with you. "Please," Cordelia said. Dante's been distracted lately, since the wedding. He looked at her directly. "The way people look at you when they want to see your reaction before they give you the rest of the information. You notice anything?" "He's busy," Cordelia said. "He's always busy. This is different." Frank's jaw moved slightly. It was a small adjustment that might have been uncertainty or might have been him deciding how much to say. "There are people in the organization asking questions about certain account movements, about who has access to what." Cordelia held his gaze. "Is that something you're asking me?" "I'm not asking you anything." He held up one hand, a small gesture that meant, "Let me finish." "I'm telling you that there are people paying attention to things they usually don't pay attention to. And in situations like that, people in your position sometimes get noticed who maybe were better off not noticed." "My position," she said. "New wife. Full access. No track record in the organization." He said it without malice, like he was reading from a document. "You understand what I'm saying." She understood exactly what he was saying. He was either warning her or testing her, and she wasn't yet sure which, and the difference mattered considerably. "I appreciate you telling me," she said. Her voice was perfectly steady. "Is there something specific I should be aware of?" Frank looked at her for 3 full seconds. Something moved through his expression that she couldn't fully read. Not suspicion, exactly. More like recalibration. Like a man who had come to deliver a message and was now not entirely sure the recipient was who he'd assumed. "Just be careful," he said. "That's all." He walked away before she could respond. Cordelia stood in the middle of the hotel lobby and breathed twice, slowly, through her nose. She had 5% less time than she'd thought. Maybe 10%. Frank had been suspicious of something, and Frank being suspicious was the earliest warning system in Dante's entire organization, which meant she could not give herself the luxury of being surprised again. When Marisol arrived 4 minutes later pulling off her sunglasses, she took one look at Cordelia's face and said, "What happened?" "I'll tell you in the car," Cordelia said. "We need to move the timeline." Day 6 was the longest of the 7. Cordelia and Patricia spent 11 hours on the phone moving through it in 2-hour stretches with breaks for food. She didn't taste her food, and she drank water mechanically. The Caruso Fund was the complicated piece. It was structured through 4 intermediary entities, 2 of which were in jurisdictions where Patricia's contacts were less certain. Extracting the documentation without disturbing the structure itself required a level of precision that made both of them move slowly. At 2 in the afternoon, Cordelia made an error. It wasn't a big error. It was a single transfer, a small test Patricia had designed to check the routing before they moved anything larger. But it went through a pathway that left a timestamp 3 hours earlier than it should have. Patricia caught it 6 minutes after it happened. "It's recoverable," Patricia said, "but we need to be aware that if someone is actively monitoring these accounts, that timestamp is visible." "How visible?" "Visible enough that if someone pulled the activity logs in the next 24 hours, they'd see it." Cordelia looked at the ceiling of the hotel room. How likely is that? How cautious is the organization managing these accounts? She thought about Frank's face in the lobby. The specific way he'd said be careful. "More cautious than I'd like," she said. They adjusted the approach. It cost them 3 hours and pushed the final documentation work into the early morning of day 7. This was the day Dante was leaving for the weekend. A weekend that Cordelia now understood was not a business trip to Philadelphia, as he'd told her, but a 4-day stay at a resort in Newport with Elena Vasquez booked 7 weeks ago under a name she'd found in the tablet search history. She had not confronted him about it. She had not said anything at all. She had continued to sit across from him at dinner and pour his wine and ask about his day. The discipline required to do that, to hold everything she knew behind the same neutral expression she'd been building for 31 years, without knowing she was building it, was the most demanding thing she had ever done. Not because it was hard to pretend, because it wasn't. Because somewhere in the last 6 days, she had realized that the face she was showing Dante was not entirely a performance, which meant it was a part of her that had existed all along, waiting for a reason to be useful. That realization frightened her more than anything else. He left on the morning of day 7 at 9:15, suitcase in the car downstairs, phone already to his ear before he reached the door. He kissed her on the cheek. He said he'd call her. He said Sal would check in if she needed anything. "Have a good trip," she said. He looked at her for half a second. One of those looks that is over before you can name what was in it, and then he was gone. She stood at the closed door and listened to the elevator. Then she called Marisol. "He's out," she said. "Patricia's already on," Marisol said. "You've got maybe 6 hours before the account activity could show up on a routine scan. We need to finish by 2. I know." Cordelia picked up her laptop. "Start the last sequence." They worked through the morning without stopping. Patricia and Marisol were on speaker from Providence, managing the secure file transfer. Cordelia moved through the documentation with the focused stillness of someone who has decided that the time for feeling things is later, and the time for finishing things is right now. At 12:47, the last document transferred. At 12:49, the last account moved. At 12:51, Cordelia sat in the chair by the window. Her window, the one she'd stood at the night she found out, the one she'd spent 7 mornings at with her coffee. And she looked at the screen for a long time without speaking. "It's done," Patricia said on the phone. "Yeah," Cordelia said. "How are you?" It was a human question in a day that had been mostly logistics, and Cordelia was not prepared for it. She pressed her knuckles briefly to her mouth, held them there, then took her hand down. "Ask me again tomorrow," she said. She hung up. She stood. She moved through the hotel room, picking up the things that were hers. Not many. She had been careful not to accumulate things she couldn't carry. And she packed a bag that she had already packed and repacked twice in the last 3 days. The practice of it, until she could do it in 8 minutes without thinking. She opened the small drawer of the nightstand and took out her wedding ring. She held it in her palm for a moment. It was a beautiful ring. Simple. Like the dress had been simple, because she'd chosen it herself in a moment when she'd thought choosing carefully was a form of honesty. She set it back down on the nightstand, not throwing it, not hiding it. She placed it exactly in the center of the small drawer's surface, like a period at the end of a sentence. She wrote the note on hotel stationery, 4 words in her own handwriting. She'd thought about those 4 words for 3 days. In the end, she chose them not because they were devastating, though they were, but because they were accurate, and accuracy had been her North Star for the last 7 days. "I know, good luck." She placed it beside the ring. She looked at the room one last time. The window, the desk, the bed that had never been shared. Something moved through her chest that was not grief exactly, or not only grief, but something older and less nameable. The feeling of having survived something by changing into a different shape in the middle of it, and not yet knowing whether the new shape was permanent. She picked up her bag. She walked to the door. She didn't look back, because looking back was the kind of thing a person does when they're not entirely sure they're leaving. And Cordelia Moretti, who would go back to being Cordelia Ashford by the end of the week through documents Patricia had already prepared, was entirely sure. She stepped into the hallway. The door closed behind her with the soft definitive sound of a hotel door that has never once in its life been slammed. And somewhere in Newport, in a resort suite booked under a false name, Dante Moretti was ordering room service for 2. His phone was quiet, and the account notification that would reach him in approximately 4 hours had not yet arrived. The cab to South Station took 11 minutes. Cordelia sat in the back with her bag on her lap and her phone face down against her thigh. She watched Boston move past the windows the way you watch a city when you're already thinking of it in the past tense. The driver had the radio on low. Some mid-morning talk show. Two people disagreeing about something with the practiced energy of people paid to disagree. The sound of it was strangely grounding, ordinary in a way that nothing else in the last 7 days had been. She was 40 minutes ahead of schedule. That was the first thing that should have told her something was wrong. When things go exactly right, there is usually a reason. The reason is usually that the disaster is still ahead of you, rather than behind you. She didn't think that yet. She was still in the clean, almost weightless feeling that follows the completion of something enormous. The specific exhaustion of a person who has held themselves together through an act of will and is only now allowing the muscles to remember they are muscles. She texted Marisol, a single word, "Done." Marisol responded with hearts that meant she understood everything the word contained. At South Station, Cordelia bought a ticket to New York on the 11:40 Amtrak, cash. She had been carrying cash for 4 days, drawing it from a personal account that had no connection to anything Dante adjacent, $200 at a time from 3 different ATMs across the city. Small enough amounts that they wouldn't flag. Frequent enough that she had what she needed. She sat in the waiting area with her bag between her feet and her coat across her lap and her phone in her hand. And she was looking at a boarding gate when her phone rang. Patricia. She answered it immediately. "I'm at the station. Everything, Cordelia." Patricia's voice was different. Not the composed, methodical voice of the last 7 days. Something stripped back from it. Something underneath showing, "Don't get on that train yet." Cordelia's hand tightened on the phone. "What happened?" "The Caruso Fund." A breath. "When we moved the documentation this morning, the activity triggered a security protocol that I didn't know existed. An automatic alert. It went to a monitoring service. Whose monitoring service? A beat. 1 beat too long. The name on the account for the monitoring service is Thomas Riley," Patricia said. "He's an attorney. I pulled his firm. He's listed as general counsel for a holding company called Meridian Capital Partners. But Meridian's board of directors includes Frank Calabrese," Cordelia said. "Silence, yes," Patricia said. Cordelia stood up from the waiting area bench without deciding to stand. She was on her feet with her bag in her hand, and she was walking toward the main concourse of the station, not toward the platform, just moving, because staying still in that moment felt structurally impossible. "How long ago did the alert go out?" She said, based on the timestamp, approximately 90 minutes. 90 minutes. She'd been in the hotel room 90 minutes ago. She'd been packing her bag 90 minutes ago. "Can you tell who received it?" "The monitoring service sends to 3 addresses. 2 of them are corporate emails from Meridian. The third is a personal address that I'm tracing now, but Cordelia." Patricia paused, and the pause had weight in it. "If Frank Calabrese has this, Dante has it within the hour. If Dante already has it, he knows I'm gone." Cordelia stopped walking. She was in the middle of the main concourse, people moving in every direction around her. She stood in the center of it and was extraordinarily still. "He knows exactly what I did." "Not exactly." Patricia said carefully. The alert would show the account access and the transfer activity. It wouldn't show the documentation files. Those moved through a separate pathway. "Can he trace where I sent them?" "The files? No. They went through 3 encrypted relays. That part is clean." "And the money?" A pause. "Shorter this time, but not comfortable. The trust is protected. He can contest it legally. But that process takes months and requires him to explain how the money got into a joint account in the first place, which opens questions he won't want opened. The money is safe. But he can find me," Cordelia said. "It wasn't a question. He will certainly try. And he has resources for that. That I don't have a complete picture of," Cordelia finished. She turned slowly in the middle of the concourse. There was a man near the coffee kiosk who was looking at his phone. There was a woman by the information board who had been standing there too long, without looking at the board. There was a security guard making a circuit of the space that didn't look quite like a routine circuit. She was being paranoid. Probably. "Patricia," she said quietly, "get off this line and destroy the call log. Text me when it's done." She hung up before Patricia could respond. She walked to the women's restroom in the main concourse, went into the last stall, locked the door. She stood against it, with both hands pressed flat against the metal surface, and breathed. In through the nose, out through the mouth. The way you do it when your body is trying to get ahead of your mind, and you need them to move at the same speed. 90 minutes. Frank had 90 minutes on her. That meant Dante had somewhere between 45 minutes and nothing, depending on where Frank had been when the alert came through and how fast he decided to use it. She needed to think, and she needed to think in order, because the order mattered. Dante had the alert. The alert told him the accounts had been accessed. He would know within minutes, if he didn't already know, that she had taken the money. He would go to the hotel room. He would find the ring and the note. He would understand what had happened in a broad sense. That understanding would be followed in a man like Dante, not by grief or shock, but by the immediate activation of every resource he possessed. She had planned for this. She had planned to be on a train before any of it happened. She was not on a train. She took out her phone. She opened the contact she'd saved 6 days ago under the name of an art supply store and dialed. It rang 4 times before a man answered, with a voice that sounded like it came from a larger man than he was. "Yeah, it's Cordelia Ashford," she said. "I need the second option." A brief silence. Timeline moved up. 90 minutes ago. "Okay." The sound of movement, something being set down or picked up. Penn Station, track 14. "There's a man named Osvaldo who sells newspapers. Tell him you're looking for the courier. That's it? He'll handle the rest. Don't take a cab, subway, or walk." The man paused. "You remember what I said about the phone?" "Yes." "Do it before Penn Station, not after, before." "Understood." She hesitated. "Thank you." He had already hung up. The second option had cost her $3,000 in cash, paid 8 days ago to a woman Patricia knew. She worked in what Patricia described without elaboration as document facilitation. Cordelia had paid it out of the personal account before the wedding, before she'd even fully formulated what she was planning. It was the best decision she'd made in the entire 7 days, because it meant there was no trace of it in anything Dante could access. She left the restroom. She walked through the station without hurrying, which was harder than running. She went down to the subway, paid cash for a card, and got on the red line, heading towards South Boston. The subway to Penn Station from South Station was not logical, and therefore was the right choice. On the train, she sat with her bag on her lap, and she made 3 calls in 11 minutes. The first was to Marisol. "Don't call me after this. Don't text. If anyone asks where I am, you haven't heard from me since the day before the wedding. You don't know anything." "I mean it, Mari." Marisol's voice was careful and precise in the way it got when she was scared but refusing to show it. "Are you safe right now?" "Right now, yes. Will you be safe in an hour?" "I'm working on it." "Cordelia, a beat. You call me when you can, even 1 word. You call me. I will." She hung up and switched to the second call, a number in Florence she had memorized but never dialed. She had a 45-second conversation in Italian that she had also rehearsed, though she had hoped she would not need to use it this quickly. The woman on the other end confirmed dates and arrangements and said, very calmly, "We'll have everything ready." Cordelia thanked her and hung up. The third call she made to Patricia. "When it's safe, get the documentation to the addresses we discussed. Don't wait for me to confirm. If you don't hear from me by Friday, move it. Cordelia, promise me." A pause. "I promise." She ended the call. Then she took the SIM card out of her phone, broke it with her thumbnail. Harder than she expected, she had to bend it back and forth 3 times before it cracked, and drop the pieces into a trash can at the next station stop. She got off the train 1 stop early and walked the remaining 8 blocks to the connection she needed, because walking gave her time to see whether anyone was behind her. No one was. Or if they were better at it than she could detect, which was its own kind of problem she couldn't do anything about. Dante Moretti found out at 12:33. He was at the resort bar, not drinking. Dante rarely drank before 2 in the afternoon. He was having sparkling water with lime, because that was what he ordered in places where he needed to look relaxed without being relaxed when Frank called. He listened to Frank for 45 seconds without speaking. Then he said, "Say that again?" Frank said it again. Dante set the sparkling water down on the bar with a precise, deliberate movement. The kind of movement that exists specifically to give the hand something to do when the brain is processing something that doesn't fit any existing category. "When did the alert come through?" he'd said. 10:41, Frank said. "I was going to call you right away, but I needed to verify. You called me at 12:33, Frank." A silence from Frank's end that had the quality of a man becoming very aware of his own breathing. "I needed to know what we were dealing with before I thought you needed 2 hours. Dante's voice had not risen. It never did, which was one of the reasons it was more frightening than the voices that did. "Get to the hotel. Send 2 men ahead of you. Call me the second you're in the room." He ended the call. He sat at the bar for exactly 10 seconds. This was how long it took him to build the complete structure of what had just happened from the incomplete information Frank had given him. 10 seconds. He was very fast at this, had been fast at it his entire life. The ability to take partial information and fill the rest of it in from architecture and logic, and the specific shape of what was missing. The accounts, the access he'd given her, the week she'd been quiet and helpful and entirely herself. Except, and he saw this now in a different light, the way you see an image in a photograph that means something different once you know what you're looking at. Except for the moment she hadn't quite been herself. The book she'd been reading without reading. The way she'd answered his questions about sleep and food a half-second too smoothly, like someone reciting rather than responding. He had missed it. He, Dante Moretti, who had built an empire on the precise reading of people, who had survived 20 years in an industry where reading people wrong was a terminal mistake. He had missed it because he had looked at Cordelia and seen what he expected to see. The thought arrived like a blade between ribs. He left the bar. He went upstairs without telling Elena anything, because this was not a moment for explanations. Elena, who was perceptive, would see it in his face before he could arrange his face, so he moved fast. In the suite, he took out a second phone. Not the one he used for routine business, the other one. The one that only 6 people in the world had the number for. He called a man named Victor Gaines, who was not listed anywhere in any of Dante's official structures. Victor had a specific and valuable set of skills that Dante paid a substantial monthly retainer to keep available. "I need a trace," Dante said. "Personal accounts under the name Cordelia Ashford. Any account she may have opened in the last 3 months using her maiden name. I need to know what was moved, where it went, and any associated contact numbers used in the last 72 hours. Victor Gaines asked 3 questions. Dante answered them in 8 words total. 4 hours, Victor said. 2, Dante said. I'll add 50%. 3, Victor said. Done. He hung up and called Frank back. Frank was in a car, heading to the hotel. Tell me about the monitoring alert, exactly what the report showed. Frank told him. Dante listened without interrupting. He was standing in the middle of the resort suite with one hand in his pocket and his eyes on the wall. Not seeing the wall, seeing instead a map he was building in his head. Entry points, exit points, the available routes from the hotel, the timing. She had left in the late morning. She had roughly a 2-hour head start, maybe less. She wouldn't have gone to the airport. She was careful enough to know the airport required documentation, and documentation left trails. Train, bus, car service with cash. Where would she go? That was the question. That was the question that mattered more than any other at this particular moment. And Dante turned it over with the same precision he applied to every tactical problem. And for the first time in a long time, he found that he didn't have an answer, because he didn't know her. He had been with her for 3 years. He had married her 7 days ago. He had sat across from her at dinner 400 times, and he did not know where she would go when she needed to disappear. He did not know who she would call. He did not know the texture of her fear or her resolve or the specific geography of what she considered safe. He had never needed to know those things, and he had not bothered to learn them. And that oversight was now a hole in his intelligence network, the size of everything. Frank called from the hotel room at 1:18. She's gone, Frank said. Clean. Bags gone. Personal items gone. She left the ring. A pause. And in this pause, Dante could hear Frank's breathing and the sound of him moving through the room. There's a note. What does it say? Frank read it. 4 words. Dante stood very still. Then he said, "The accounts. What's the total movement? I've got preliminary numbers from Riley. Looks like 4.2 million from the joint accounts." The Caruso Fund documentation was accessed, but we're still figuring out what she took from it and where it went. She didn't take money from Caruso. She took information. Dante said it slowly, working it out as he spoke. "She's not a thief, Frank. She's smarter than that. She took evidence." Another silence from Frank. Longer this time, and when he spoke again, his voice had a different quality, a careful flatness. Evidence of what specifically? Everything she could get her hands on. Dante moved to the window of the resort suite, without knowing he was moving. Outside was the Atlantic, gray and vast and indifferent, which means she's not running to be safe. She's running to use it. Use it how? I don't know yet. His jaw tightened. Find her. I don't care what it costs. I want every person we have in Boston looking in the next 30 minutes. Dante. Frank's voice shifted, carefully. The way Frank shifted when he was about to say something Dante wouldn't like. "There's something else. Say it." 3 of the captains got messages this afternoon. Anonymous, encrypted. Dante turned from the window. "What kind of messages?" he said. "Account numbers, transaction records, names." Frank paused. Sal's name specifically, with dates that matched the situation we handled in March. The situation in March was the kind that could end a man in several different ways, only one of which involved the law. "Who sent them?" Dante said. "We don't know yet." "But Dante," Frank stopped then. "The timing. She left this morning. These messages went out this afternoon. That's not a coincidence." Dante heard this. He absorbed it. He placed it in the architecture of what had happened and felt the complete shape of it for the first time. And what he felt in that moment was something he would not have been able to name clearly, because it was not one thing. It was grief and fury, and a specific and unusual variety of something close to respect, all tangled together in a way that none of them were clean. She hadn't just left. She had left and lit the building on fire on her way out. "Get Sal on the phone," Dante said. "Get all of them on the phone. Before they start asking questions that go in the wrong direction." "It's already happening," Frank said quietly. "Carmen called me 20 minutes ago. He's asking questions." "What kind of questions?" "The kind you ask when you've just received evidence that one of your colleagues has been skimming from shared operations, and you want to know whether the boss knew about it." Dante pressed the heel of his hand against his sternum, a small, private gesture. The kind a man makes when something hits him in a place he didn't know was exposed. Sal had been skimming. Dante had known about it, had been handling it in his own time, in his own way. This was not the way it looked to someone who just received an anonymous document suggesting a cover-up. Cordelia couldn't have known that. She'd sent the information without knowing what it would land on top of, what internal fractures it would find and widen, or she had known, or she had guessed. Or she was perceptive enough to understand that in a structure built on loyalty and controlled information, any information that moved without permission was a fracture point, regardless of its content. "Handle Carmine," Dante said. "I'm coming back to Boston tonight." He was already moving toward his suitcase when Elena appeared in the doorway of the bedroom. She had the look of a woman who had been listening to enough to understand the shape of what was happening without knowing the specific details. She was holding a coffee cup in both hands, and she looked at him with an expression he'd never quite seen on her before. "You need to go," she said. It wasn't a question. "Elena, it's fine." She said it with a cleanness that was worse than anger. "Go. It's fine." He looked at her for a moment. He thought about saying several things. He said none of them, because there was no version of the truth available to him right now that would serve any useful purpose. And Dante Moretti did not expend energy on gestures that served no useful purpose. He picked up his suitcase and left. In the elevator down, he stood alone and stared at the doors and thought about 4 words written in Cordelia's handwriting on hotel stationery. "I know, good luck." The note didn't say "I hate you." It didn't say "you'll regret this." It didn't threaten or perform or reach for impact the way people reach for impact when they want the other person to feel the size of what they've done. It said, "I know," which meant, "I have always been more awake in this situation than you understood." And it said, "Good luck," which meant, "You are going to need it. And I already know you don't have enough of it. and I am already gone by the time you read this." He had looked at Cordelia Ashford for 3 years and seen a woman he could manage. What he had actually married was a woman who had spent 3 years deciding whether he was worth the full weight of her attention. She had decided he wasn't, and now she was gone, and 3 of his captains were reading documents they were never meant to see. And Frank Calabresi, 18 years, the most reliable man Dante had ever worked with, was on the phone with a voice that had that careful flatness that meant he was managing his own set of questions. And the empire that had taken 20 years to build was beginning in small and very specific ways to ask itself whether it had been built on the right foundation. Victor Gaines called back in 2 hours and 40 minutes. Dante was in a car heading back to Boston, doing 90 on the highway with a driver who understood that this was not the moment for conversation when the second phone rang. "Personal account under Ashford opened 11 weeks ago at a credit union in Hartford," Victor said. "Small balance, consistent small withdrawals over the last 10 days from ATMs in downtown Boston. Last withdrawal was 4 days ago. Account is clean, no digital trail after the withdrawals. Contact numbers? One number used in the last 72 hours is a prepaid, already deactivated." Victor paused. "The other 2 numbers she called are landlines. One is a law office in Hartford, Patricia Reyes, Financial Forensics. The second is an international number, Italian country code Florence. Dante sat with that for a moment. He knew almost nothing about Cordelia's connection to Florence. He had not paid enough attention to the specific geographies of who she was when she wasn't with him. He remembered vaguely that she had done some work with a restoration program before they met. Art restoration. Renaissance something. She hadn't gone to New York. She hadn't gone to hide somewhere familiar. She had gone to the place she'd been before him, which was the place he'd never thought to map. "She's heading to Europe," Dante said. "I'd estimate she's already in New York," Victor said. "She had enough of a start." "If she's smart about it, she's smart about it," Dante said, and the words came out flat and certain, with none of the bitterness that should have been in them and all of something else instead. "Then she's probably at JFK or Newark by now, possibly already on a flight. Can you pull passenger manifests?" Victor was quiet for 2 seconds. "Under her name? Yes, under a different name that depends on what name she's using." And there it was. The woman that Patricia Reyes worked for. The document specialist, Cordelia, had paid $3,000 in cash before her own wedding. Dante didn't know about her, wouldn't find her, and the name Cordelia was traveling under right now existed in a piece of infrastructure Dante had no access to. He had resources. He had men in cities across the country and contacts in 3 federal agencies who returned his calls out of various forms of self-interest. He had money and reach and 20 years of favors owed. And she had disappeared into a name he didn't know, heading for a city he'd never tracked her to, carrying evidence that was already in motion, moving toward addresses that were already receiving it. Dante ended the call. He looked out the window at the highway, passing at 90 miles an hour. He understood, with the specific and terrible clarity of a man who has spent his life understanding tactical situations, that he was not going to find Cordelia Ashford tonight. He was not going to find her tomorrow. And the longer it took him to find her, the more the documents would move and the more his captains would talk. The more the structure that had kept everything in place would develop the kinds of cracks that didn't close. He had built his empire on the assumption that loyalty was a wall. What Cordelia had understood, what she had used with patience and precision, and the full weight of an intelligence he had casually dismissed for 3 years, was that loyalty was only ever a wall until someone found the right crack. And she had spent 7 days finding every crack there was. The car moved through the dark at 90 miles an hour. Dante Moretti sat in the back of it with his hands in his lap and did something he had not done in a very long time. He admitted to himself that he had lost. Not everything, not yet. There were moves still available to him, damage still containable, if he moved fast enough and smart enough and was willing to sacrifice certain things he had not yet considered sacrificing. But the version of his life that had existed 8 days ago, the clean, powerful, untouchable version that was already gone. She had taken it with her. In the quiet of the back seat, with the highway lights strobing past, and Frank's voice on the other phone, talking about Carmine and contingencies, Dante Moretti pressed his thumb against the inside of his own wedding ring. Still on his finger, he had not taken it off. It was a fact he noticed only now and did not fully understand. He felt something move through him that was not anger and was not grief, but was the specific sensation of a man who has spent his entire life being the most dangerous person in every room he entered, suddenly becoming aware that for the past 7 days, he had not been in the room at all. She had been the dangerous one, and he had handed her the keys. The first thing Dante did when he got back to Boston was fire Frank Calabrese, not with words. Dante didn't use words for things like that. He walked into the penthouse at 11:47 at night. He looked at Frank standing in the living room with 2 other men whose presence Dante had not authorized and said, "Get out of my house." Frank looked at him for 3 seconds. 3 seconds was a long time for Frank, who processed things fast and moved faster. "Dante, you had 2 hours, Frank. 2 hours, and you didn't call me. I was verifying. You were deciding." Dante set his bag down by the door. He did not raise his voice. He walked to the kitchen and poured water from the tap and drank it standing at the sink. And when he turned around, the 2 men Frank had brought were already moving toward the door. They understood the way men in their position learned to understand that the temperature in the room had changed in a way that made staying actively dangerous. You were deciding whether what she'd done was something you could use, whether the situation created an opening you wanted. Frank's face did not change. It didn't need to change. The fact that it didn't change was its own answer. "You've got 30 seconds to tell me I'm wrong," Dante said. Frank was quiet for 20 of them. "Then, the organization needs stability right now. You're distracted. People are asking questions about Sal, about the March situation, about the accounts. Someone needs to be making decisions, and you've appointed yourself. I'm trying to hold things together." "You're trying to hold yourself together," Dante said. "And you're doing it with my pieces. Get out, Frank, tonight. And understand that if I find out you've talked to Carmine or anyone else in the last 12 hours in a way that I wouldn't authorize, the conversation we have next time will be in a different kind of room." Frank picked up his coat from the chair where he'd laid it. He moved to the door. He stopped with his hand on the frame and looked back, and his expression was the closest thing to honest Dante had seen from him in years, which meant it was probably the most dangerous thing Frank had done all day. "She's gone, Dante," Frank said. "Whatever you're planning to do to get her back or get back what she took, you should think hard about whether that's the war you want to fight right now, because you've got 3 other wars starting without her." He left. The door closed. Dante stood in the kitchen of the penthouse that he and Cordelia had lived in for 6 days of marriage, and he looked at the space she had occupied. A coffee mug still in the drying rack, a book spine up on the counter, a scarf hung over the back of a chair. And the particular quality of the silence in the room was the kind that has a person-shaped absence in the middle of it. He picked up the scarf. He set it down. He called Victor Gaines. By 2 a.m, Dante had a war room that was not called a war room because Dante didn't use theatrical language, but functionally, that was what it was. 4 men around the dining room table, laptops open, phones active, a whiteboard on the wall that one of them had brought up from the car and that now had 3 columns on it in black marker. The first column was labeled accounts. The second was labeled documentation. The third was labeled location. The location column had 1 entry, Florence unconfirmed. Victor was working remotely pulling passenger manifests from every transatlantic flight out of JFK and Newark from the previous 12 hours. The problem, as he'd explained to Dante twice, was that he was looking for a name he didn't have, which meant he was cross-referencing against everything he could eliminate rather than everything he could confirm. Single female traveler, 31, traveling light, Victor had said, that describes about 400 people on tonight's manifest. Narrow it by destination, Dante said. Italy first, then France. She might connect through Paris, then anywhere with a restoration or arts community connection. That's still a wide field, then work faster. At 2:45, Sal arrived. Salvatore D'Amico was 51 years old, broad through the shoulders, with the scar through his left eyebrow that he'd had since he was 23. His expression had been permanently reconfigured by 2 decades of needing to look like nothing surprised him. He sat down across from Dante without being invited and put both hands flat on the table. "Tell me what she sent Carmine," Dante said. Sal looked at the whiteboard, then at Dante. "You already know what she sent Carmine. I want to hear you say it." Sal's jaw moved. The Harborside transactions, the March dates, the withdrawal amounts, and the routing through the Breslin account, which you ran without authorization, Dante said. "Which I ran because at the time I had a situation that Sal." Dante's voice was very quiet. "I'm not asking you to justify it. I've known about Harborside since April. I'm asking you what Carmine saw specifically, so I understand exactly how bad the next conversation with Carmine is going to be." Sal sat back. Something moved through his face that was not quite relief and not quite shame, but occupied the space between them. He saw enough to ask whether you knew and whether you covered it. "And what did you tell him?" "I told him I'd talk to you." Sal paused. "He's not the only one who got a message. Benedetto got one too. His was about the Westport situation." Dante was still. "The Westport situation wasn't yours." "No," Sal said. "It was yours." The room was very quiet. The 2 men who weren't Sal had found reasons to look at their laptops. Dante stood up from the table and walked to the window. Boston at 3 in the morning was a city that had given up on looking awake and was just moving out of habit. He put one hand on the glass and felt the cold of it. Cordelia had not known about Westport. She couldn't have known. Westport was buried under 4 layers of entities and had never been discussed in writing, not once. Not anywhere that a tablet left on a nightstand could have accessed, which meant the Westport documentation had come from somewhere else. Someone else. Who else knew about Westport? Dante said. He was still looking at the window. Sal was quiet. "Sal," he turned. "Who else knew?" "Me," Sal said. "Frank and the attorney who structured it, Riley. The attorney who ran the monitoring service for the Caruso Fund. The attorney whose name was on the alert that had flagged Cordelia's account access and sent it to Frank Calabrese 2 hours before Frank called Dante. Frank sent the Westport documentation to Benedetto," Dante said. "Not a question, a blueprint assembling itself." Sal looked at his hands. "I don't know that." "You don't know it," Dante said, "but you think it." Sal said nothing, which was his version of yes. Frank had not been holding things together. Frank had been dismantling them selectively and laying the pieces at the feet of the captains in a pattern designed to raise questions about Dante's judgment and authority. Questions that, in an organization where confidence was the only real currency, were as damaging as any federal indictment. Cordelia's files had been the spark, but Frank had been carrying the fuel for months. Dante had 2 problems, and they had collided in the same 12 hours, and neither of them was separable from the other, which was either very bad luck or a level of coordination that he refused to consider possible because the alternative that Frank and Cordelia had somehow coordinated. No, Frank didn't know Cordelia, couldn't have known what she was planning. The timing was coincidence, and coincidence in Dante's world was usually just 2 forces hitting the same fault line from different directions. But the result was the same either way. "Get out," Dante said to Sal. "I'll call Carmine in the morning. You don't say anything to anyone between now and then." Sal stood. He moved to the door and stopped without turning around. "For what it's worth," he said, "I didn't think she had it in her." "Neither did I," Dante said. Sal left. The call from Carmine Russo came at 7:15 in the morning, and it was worse than Dante had expected, which was saying something because Dante had spent the night expecting the worst version of it. Carmine was 64, had been in the organization longer than almost anyone, and had a voice like gravel processed through a machine that processed gravel. He did not waste time. "I got a package," Carmine said. "You know what kind." "I know," Dante said. "I want to know if what's in it is accurate." "Which part? Don't play cute with me." A sound from Carmine's end that might have been him setting something down with force. "The Harborside numbers. Are they accurate?" "Yes." Silence. "Then you knew." "Since April, and you were handling it." "I was handling it my way on my timeline," Dante said, "which I have always done, and which has always been the arrangement." "The arrangement," Carmine said, "is that we don't steal from each other without consequences. The arrangement is not that the boss finds out and sits on it for 6 months, while the man who did it is still sitting at our table. Carmine, I'm not done. His voice had not gotten louder. It had gotten quieter, which was worse. I also got a second package. This one about Westport and Dante. I've been in this life for 40 years, and I understand why certain things get structured the way they get structured. But what I'm looking at right now, the way those numbers move through those entities, looks to me like a man who has been using organizational resources to fund a private project that nobody else knew about. Dante's hand tightened on the phone. That's not what it is. Then what is it? It's complicated and it requires a conversation in person, not on this line. I agree, Carmine said, which is why I'm asking you to come to dinner tomorrow night at my house, just us. A pause. And I'm asking you to understand that if you don't come, or if you come and you don't give me answers I can work with, then I'm going to start having conversations with other people. You understand what I'm saying. I understand exactly what you're saying. Good. Another pause, longer, and then with something in it that was not warmth, but was the distant memory of warmth. I've known you for 22 years, Dante. I've watched you build something most men in our position never get close to. I don't want to be sitting across from you as an enemy, but I need to know you're still the man I knew. The line went quiet. Dante sat at the kitchen counter of his penthouse, with the phone still at his ear after Carmine had hung up, and he stared at the coffee mug in the drying rack that was not his coffee mug. And he understood that the dinner with Carmine was not a dinner. It was an audition. And if he failed it, Carmine would do what Carmine had always done with men who failed auditions. And Dante had always respected Carmine's consistency on that particular point. He had 28 hours. He picked up the other phone and called Victor. Where are we? I've eliminated about 60% of the transatlantic manifest, Victor said. He sounded like he'd been up all night, which he had. I've got 37 possibles on flights that landed in Italy between midnight and 6 a.m. local, cross-referencing against Florence specifically. 3 direct Florence connections, 14 with connecting stops that could route there. Send me all 17. Dante, without a name, send me the profiles. I'll find her. He would find her. He had to find her, not because of the money. The money was a loss he could absorb, legally messy, but absorbable, and not even primarily because of the documents, though the documents were a wound that needed closing. He had to find her because Cordelia had something that no manifest or financial record contained. She had the complete architecture of the last 7 days. She had seen him operate, seen his people operate, been given access to the machinery of 20 years, and had used it with a precision that meant she understood it in ways that went beyond what she'd read on a tablet. If she chose to keep using it, if she was not simply disappearing, but actually in motion, actively working, talking to people who mattered, then the dinner with Carmine tomorrow night was not the problem. The dinner with Carmine would be the thing Dante didn't survive long enough to get to. He needed to find her. And in the same breath, in the same moment, standing in the kitchen of the penthouse, with the cold morning light coming through the windows, he knew he wasn't going to. Not fast enough. Marisol was in her studio in Providence when the men arrived. She knew what they were before she opened the door. Because she'd grown up adjacent enough to certain kinds of people to recognize the specific way they stood on a front step. Too still. Weight on the balls of their feet, the particular blankness that is not emptiness but discipline. She opened the door anyway, because not opening it would have been its own kind of answer. There were 2 of them. The one who spoke was younger, maybe 35, with a Boston accent he wasn't hiding, and a way of holding himself that suggested he'd been told to be polite and found it uncomfortable. Miss Reyes, he said, we'd like to ask you a few questions about your friend. I don't have a friend, Marisol said. Mrs. Moretti, I don't know where she is. This was true, and Marisol said it with the steadiness of someone who has decided in advance that the truth is the safest option, because it has the advantage of being consistent. I haven't heard from her in over a week. When did you last speak to her? The night before her wedding. The younger man looked at her. The older one, who hadn't spoken, was looking past her into the studio, which was full of the organized chaos of someone who worked with their hands. Canvases, paint, tools, stacked frames, and which contained nothing of Cordelia's. You drove up to Boston during the week, the younger man said. The 14th. Marisol held his gaze. I had a meeting with a gallery on Newbury Street. I had lunch with an old friend. I came home. You didn't see Mrs. Moretti. I called her. She didn't pick up. I assumed she was busy. A pause. She was on her honeymoon. Another look between the two men. The younger one reached into his jacket pocket and produced a card. No name on it, just a phone number, printed in plain black text. If you hear from her, he said, we'd appreciate a call. Of course, Marisol said. She closed the door. She stood in her studio and breathed through her nose and counted to 60 before she moved. Then she went to her workbench, picked up the phone she kept there for work calls. A landline because the signal in the studio was unreliable, and also because Marisol had always preferred things she could see the physical mechanism of and stared at it for a moment. She did not call Cordelia. She had no way to call Cordelia. Cordelia had severed that line deliberately, and Marisol understood why, had understood it even in the moment it happened. Because she knew Cordelia, and she knew what Cordelia was capable of when she made a decision with her whole self, rather than just the front half. What she did instead was call Patricia Reyes, her cousin, who picked up on the second ring. 2 men just left my door, Marisol said. They're looking for her. Patricia's voice was immediate and focused. Did they identify themselves? No, they had a card with just a number. Not Federal, Patricia said. Federal identifies. This is his people. A sound of movement. How much did you give them? Nothing. But they know I was in Boston on the 14th. They probably pulled traffic camera footage or hotel records near wherever you met. Patricia paused. Are you okay? I'm fine. I am. Yes, I'm fine. Marisol sat down on the edge of her workbench. How close are they to finding her? They're not close, Patricia said. She's where she's supposed to be, and she's under a name that doesn't connect to anything they can trace. But the pressure is going to keep building. And there are things moving on the documentation side that are going to accelerate the pressure on him. And when people are under that kind of pressure, they sometimes find angles that shouldn't be findable. What does that mean practically? It means we watch and we wait, and we trust that she did everything she needed to do before she left. Patricia paused, which she did. She was extraordinarily thorough. She always was, Marisol said quietly. That was the thing about her that everyone missed. In Florence, it was mid-afternoon. Cordelia Ashford, that name, her name, the one on the clean documentation that had been prepared by a woman in Hartford who had never asked a single unnecessary question, was standing in a room with high ceilings and old light. It had the specific kind of quiet that only very old buildings have, the kind that has been accumulating for centuries and has gotten very good at absorbing human noise. She was looking at a painting. It was a damaged one, 15th century, oil on wood panel, a Madonna and Child with a crack running through the lower left quadrant, and a section of loss near the top edge where moisture had gotten behind the surface at some point in its long life and separated the paint from the ground beneath. The colors were still extraordinary under the damage. Deep blue and ochre and a red that had survived 500 years without losing the specific warmth of the pigment the original painter had mixed by hand. The woman standing beside her was named Julia, 61 years old, who ran the restoration atelier and who had spoken to Cordelia twice by phone before agreeing to the arrangement. She had met her at the door that morning with the practical efficiency of someone who did not need a detailed explanation of why a person might need to start their life somewhere new. The crack is structural, Julia said. The panel has moved. We'll need to stabilize before we address the surface. I know, Cordelia said. I've done panel stabilization before in graduate school. You'll have forgotten half of what you learned. Probably, Cordelia said, but the half I remember is the part that matters. Julia looked at her for a moment, with the particular attention of a person who is deciding whether to ask a question they've already decided not to ask. You'll be in the apartment above the studio. The rent is what we discussed. You take meals with us on Tuesdays and Fridays if you want them. Thank you. You don't need to thank me. Julia moved toward the door of the room. Come. I'll show you the storage archive before the light goes. Cordelia looked at the painting for one more moment. The Madonna's face was serene in the specific way of devotional paintings, that medieval and early Renaissance capacity for stillness that modern faces rarely managed. But there was something in the damage, in the crack running through the lower left, in the missing piece near the top, that made the image feel more present than it had before the damage, more real. The loss was visible, and the visibility of it made the rest of the image matter in a different way. She followed Julia out of the room. In Boston, Dante was on the phone with a federal contact who was carefully not returning his call. In Providence, Marisol was cleaning brushes and watching the street through her studio window. In Hartford, Patricia was preparing an encrypted file transfer to 2 addresses that had been agreed upon before Cordelia left the country, and in 3 separate locations around the city of Boston. 3 of Dante's captains were sitting with documents they had received from an anonymous source. They were making phone calls to each other that Dante did not know about. And the content of those calls was moving in a direction that Frank Calabrese, who was sitting in a bar in Charlestown, watching his own phone, waiting for a message from Carmine Russo that had not yet arrived, had been counting on for months. At 6:04 in the evening, Dante Moretti's federal contact finally returned his call. The man's name was Agent Paul Donovan, and he had been for 11 years the specific variety of federal problem that money made manageable. Not corrupt exactly, not on payroll, but occupying a gray area of selectively inattentive oversight that had served Dante's interest during a period of particular federal scrutiny 2 years prior. Donovan's voice on the phone was not the voice of a man managing a gray area. "I'm going to say this once," Donovan said, "and then you and I don't talk again. Do you understand me? Not on this number. Not on any number." Dante's hand tightened on the phone. "Talk. Someone sent documentation to the field office this morning, addressed to my supervisor." A pause. Not my supervisor's general inbox. Her personal case file for an ongoing investigation. Which means whoever sent it knew the structure of an active federal operation that is not public. Dante was very still. "The documentation includes transaction records, account numbers, and correspondence," Donovan continued. "It also includes, and this is the part where I need you to understand that I am telling you this as the last thing I am ever going to tell you. It includes a summary of certain arrangements between our offices that I cannot explain to my supervisor." "Who sent it?" Dante said. "I don't know." Another pause. "But it was sent from a relay in Europe." Italian IP on the surface, but relayed. Could be anywhere. Cordelia had been in Florence for less than 24 hours. She had landed, checked into the apartment above Julia's studio, slept for 6 hours, and then sent a package to the field office of the FBI. It was addressed to the personal case file of the supervising agent on an ongoing investigation that she had identified from documents on Dante's tablet. She had not waited. She had not given him time to get ahead of it. "Paul," Dante said, and his voice was very quiet and very clear. "No." Donovan's voice was final in a way that had no further negotiation in it. "No, Dante. We're done. Whatever comes next, I'm not in it. Figure it out." The line went dead. Dante set the phone down on the kitchen counter with extreme care, the same deliberate precision he'd used the night before with the sparkling water. The hands doing something specific while the mind caught up. Carmine Russo in 22 hours. 3 captains with documents and phone calls he wasn't part of. Frank Calabrese at a bar in Charlestown, positioning himself for a transition of authority. A federal supervisor with Dante's name attached to an active case file in a way that Donovan couldn't contain. And Cordelia somewhere in Florence, not hiding, not done, actively working from a position of safety that Dante had helped finance with the joint accounts he'd set up to make the marriage look real. She had been methodical. She had been patient. She had moved through 7 days with the focus of someone who understood that she had one opportunity to get this exactly right and had not allowed herself the luxury of rushing. And she had not stopped when she crossed the ocean. That was what he had not prepared for. He had imagined her disappearing. He had even, in the back of his mind, allowed that she might expose him, send files to federal investigators, do the kind of damage that was survivable, given enough time and the right legal firepower. He had not imagined that she would keep going, that she had prepared more than one wave. He had not imagined that the first wave, the money, the documents to the captains, was designed to create the noise and confusion that would occupy him while the second wave, the federal filing, hit from a direction he wasn't watching. He walked to the window. The city was orange in the evening light, the kind of color that makes everything look like it's on the edge of something. His phone rang, not the regular phone. The other one, Victor. "I found her," Victor said. "Or I found someone who matches. Female traveler, late 20s or early 30s, solo, light luggage. The passport is clean, completely clean. Nothing I can immediately flag, but the profile fits and the connection city fits." Dante's breath moved through him slowly. "Where?" "She's in Florence. She landed this morning. I've got a residential address from the entry documentation. It's an atelier on Via dei Servi. Restoration business registered to a woman named Giulia Marchetti. An address, an actual address. He had her." He stood at the window with the address in his hand. Victor had texted it, 4 lines of Italian that sat in the phone screen like a key. And he was aware of 2 things simultaneously, with a clarity that was almost physical. The first was that he could get to her. He had contacts in Italy, a man in Milan who could be in Florence in 3 hours. And the legal complexity of what she'd done, while substantial, had not yet reached the point where his reach abroad was fully compromised. He could make a call. He could have someone at that address before midnight Florence time. The second thing he was aware of was that doing so would be the most catastrophic decision he could make in this moment. And not because of the risk. He'd accepted catastrophic risks his entire life. But because of what it would mean. It would mean he was a man who sent people to retrieve his wife. It would mean he was a man whose response to being outsmarted was force, which was the response of someone who had no other available options, which was not a characterization Dante Moretti had ever permitted to attach to his name. And it would mean this was the party turned over in his mind with the deliberate attention of a man handling something fragile, that he had decided that what Cordelia had done was something that required a violent answer. He was not sure he believed that. He was not sure he had the right to believe that, given the specific sequence of events that had preceded everything she'd done. He stood at the window for a long time, then he put the phone in his pocket, address and all, and he walked away from the window. He sat down at the kitchen table, the same table where the whiteboard had been 12 hours ago, now bare, the markers capped and left on the counter. And he put both hands flat on the surface and looked at them. Carmine Russo's dinner was in 22 hours. Frank Calabrese was in a bar in Charlestown with his own agenda, and an 18-year store of institutional knowledge that made him specifically dangerous. 3 captains were talking without him. A federal supervisor had a file with his name on it, and Cordelia Ashford was in Florence restoring a 15th century painting and had, in all likelihood, more ammunition prepared and ready to deploy if he made the wrong move. This was the moment. He understood it with perfect clarity, the way you understand a door closing, where the next decision would determine what remained when everything settled. He could go after her and lose everything in the attempt. He could let her go and lose everything by degrees. Or he could do the thing that every instinct he had resisted, the thing that 20 years of building an empire had trained him to believe was impossible. He could sit at this table and admit, fully and completely, with no softening and no strategic framing, that he had no move left that didn't cost him something permanent. His hands were flat on the table. His heartbeat was steady and slow the way it always was under pressure, which was the thing he'd always been most privately proud of, that his body did not betray him. He was proud that he could stand in the middle of the worst situations of his life, and his hands did not shake, and his pulse did not spike, and his voice did not crack. His hands were flat on the table, and they were not shaking, and there was nobody left in the room to see them. The dinner with Carmine Russo happened at 7 o'clock on a Tuesday evening in a house in Newton that smelled like good cooking and old wood, and the particular kind of accumulated life that comes from living in the same place for 30 years. Carmen's wife, a small woman named Rosa, who had long ago made a private peace with the nature of her husband's work. She served food and then disappeared into another part of the house with the practiced efficiency of someone who understood that her absence was itself a form of hospitality. She set down a bowl of pasta, a plate of lamb, a bottle of red wine that Carmine poured himself, and then she was gone. The two men were alone at a dining table that seated 8 and had seen over the years conversations that would have destroyed careers and ended lives and rerouted the course of considerable amounts of money. Carmine poured the wine. He did not speak immediately. He was a man who understood that silence had weight and that using it correctly was a form of leverage, which was one of the reasons he had survived 40 years in a business that retired most of its participants in ways that did not involve a pension. Dante picked up his wine glass. He did not drink from it. He held it and looked at the table. "You look like hell," Carmine said. "I know. When did you last sleep?" "I don't remember." Carmine nodded as if this confirmed something he'd already suspected. He cut a piece of lamb and ate it, and chewed slowly and swallowed, and then he said without looking up from his plate, "Tell me about the girl." Dante sat down the wine glass. "Her name is Cordelia. I know her name. Tell me about her." So Dante told him not everything. There were things that were not Carmine's business, and never would be. And Dante was not so broken that he'd lost the ability to distinguish between what needed to be said and what needed to stay inside. But enough. The access he'd given her, the tablet, the 7 days he hadn't noticed, the accounts, the documentation, the files that had gone to the captains and to the federal case file and to addresses he still hadn't fully mapped. Carmine listened without interrupting. He ate his dinner while he listened, which was either a sign of composure or a sign that he'd heard worse things over food and had learned not to let shock interfere with appetite. When Dante finished, Carmine refilled both wine glasses and sat back in his chair. "You gave her everything," Carmine said. "I gave her access to everything. There's a difference." "Is there?" "It wasn't a question." "Dante, you gave a woman you'd known for 3 years full access to the financial architecture of an organization that took 20 years to build, because you needed the marriage to look real." "Yes." "And she used it, yes. And you didn't see it coming." A pause. "No." Carmine looked at him for a long moment. His face was the face of a man who has reached an age where judgment has mostly been replaced by assessment, where the question is no longer is this right or wrong, but what does this mean and what comes next? "The federal situation," Carmine said. "How bad?" "Bad enough that Donovan won't return calls. Bad enough that the documentation she sent is specific enough to open a formal inquiry if the supervising agent decides to pursue it." "Will she pursue it?" "I don't know her well enough to say." "But Cordelia does," Carmine said. "She knew which file to send it to, which means she understood the internal structure of an ongoing investigation." He paused. "Where did she get that?" "The tablet had communication history I hadn't fully sanitized." Carmine made a sound that was not a laugh but occupied the same space. 20 years, he said, in a tablet. "Yes," Dante said. The word came out flat and undefended. Carmine was quiet for a moment. He turned his wine glass on the table, a slow rotation, one full turn, and then back. "I'm going to tell you something, and I want you to listen to it the way you used to listen before you started believing your own reputation." Dante waited. "The captains are manageable," Carmine said. "Sal's situation is a problem, but it's a contained problem if you address it directly and don't let it become a story that someone else gets to tell. Benedetto is angry, but Benedetto is also 67 years old and does not want the disruption that comes with a change of leadership. He'll come back in line if you give him a reason to." He paused. "Frank is the problem." "Frank is handled," Dante said. "Frank is not handled. Frank is sitting in Charlestown having conversations that you don't have full visibility into. And Frank has 18 years of institutional knowledge and a grudge that is going to keep moving even if you think you've pointed it somewhere safe." Carmine's voice was precise and without drama. "Frank needs to be handled in a way that is permanent and cannot be revisited." "You understand what I'm saying?" Dante understood. "The federal situation," Carmine continued, "is going to require you to use every legal resource you have and probably compromise some relationships that have served you well. It will be expensive and it will take time, and at the end of it you will have a smaller operation than you have now. That is the realistic picture." "And the other thing," Dante said. "The girl." Carmine looked at him. "What about her?" "I have an address in Florence. I know you do." Carmine picked up his wine. "Victor Gaines has worked for me on 2 occasions. He mentioned it. He drank and set the glass down. What are you going to do with it? The dining room was very quiet. Somewhere in another part of the house, Rosa was watching television, the sound of it, a faint, ordinary undertow beneath the silence. I don't know, Dante said. It was the most honest thing he'd said in the last 4 days, maybe longer. Carmine looked at him for a moment, that stretched in the way moments stretch when they contain something that needs to be received rather than responded to. Then he said quietly, she didn't go to the press. She didn't go public. She sent specific documentation to specific people in specific channels that would create maximum pressure on the organization and minimum public exposure. He paused. That's not the behavior of a woman who wants to destroy you. Dante was still. That's the behavior of a woman who wants you to know she could have, Carmine said, and chose not to. The distinction arrived in Dante's chest like something physical, a pressure he hadn't expected. He sat with it. She had known, when she constructed the documentation packages, what would cause maximum damage versus what would simply cause maximum noise. She had chosen the former with surgical precision and declined the latter entirely. There had been no call to journalists, no public filing, no anonymous tip to the kind of press that would have run the story in 48 hours and made it impossible to contain. She had hurt him in the specific ways that would force a reckoning. She had not tried to bury him. He had not known, until Carmine said it, that he'd been carrying the weight of that distinction without naming it. Go home, Carmine said. Sleep. Come back to me in 3 days with a plan for Frank and a realistic picture of what the federal exposure looks like with your attorney's assessment attached. We'll talk about the rest. And the dinner, Dante said. The audition. Carmine almost smiled. You've been sitting at this table for an hour answering every question I asked you to directly, and without theater, he said. That's the audition. You passed it. Now go home. Dante drove himself home, which he almost never did. He sat in the car outside the penthouse building for 11 minutes before he went inside. He didn't know why 11 minutes specifically. There was no calculation in it, no purpose. His hands were on the wheel, and the engine was off. And the city moved around the parked car, and he sat in it the way you sit when you have been moving very fast for a very long time and have stopped. Your body needs a moment to understand that the stopping is real. He went upstairs. The penthouse was exactly as he'd left it. Cordelia's coffee mug in the drying rack, her book on the counter, the scarf over the back of a chair. He had not moved these things in 4 days, and he had not examined why until now, standing in the kitchen in his coat, looking at them with the specific attention of a man who is finally asking himself the question he's been avoiding. He picked up the book. It was a small paperback, the kind that gets soft at the corners from being carried in a bag, and the spine was cracked in a way that meant it had been read more than once. The cover was a reproduction of an Italian Renaissance painting. Madonna and Child, blue and gold, serene, and on the inside cover in handwriting, he recognized was a name, Cordelia Ashford, with a date underneath it from 9 years ago. She'd owned it since before she knew him. He stood there holding it for a moment. Then he put it down, very carefully, exactly where it had been. He called his attorney at 10:30 at night, because Marcus Webb's was the kind of attorney who answered at 10:30 because he billed accordingly, and because the calls that came at 10:30 were always the ones that mattered. He told Marcus about the federal filing without using specific names, and Marcus listened and asked 4 questions, and then told Dante that he needed 24 hours to assess, and that in the meantime, Dante should not contact anyone in the federal structure directly or indirectly. Can it be contained? Dante asked. Define contained, Marcus said. Can we prevent it from becoming a formal investigation? A pause. Realistically? No. It's already a formal inquiry, based on what you're describing. What we can do is manage the scope, establish the legal position early, and ensure that certain information is contextualized before it's interpreted. Another pause. Dante, is there anything you haven't told me tonight that would change the picture? Dante thought about Cordelia, about the address in Florence, about the probability that she had more prepared, more waves, more precisely aimed documentation ready to deploy if he made the wrong move. Probably, he said. Tell me, Marcus said. So he did. The Frank Calabrese situation was handled on a Thursday, 8 days after the wedding. Dante did not handle it himself. He had never handled things himself when a proxy served the purpose. This was both a practical preference and a discipline he'd maintained since early in his career, when he'd understood that the distance between a decision and its execution was the thing that kept decisions clean. He made a call. The call went to a man in Providence who was not Frank's friend, but who Frank trusted, because trust in their world was often a function of familiarity and shared history, rather than genuine alignment of interest. The man in Providence set up a meeting that Frank attended because the alternative, refusing a meeting, would have announced his position before he was ready to announce it. Dante was not at the meeting. He was in his attorney's office reviewing documents. What happened at the meeting was not something that required violence, which was worth noting because the easiest assumption about men in Dante's world was that violence was always the first available tool. It wasn't. It was often the last one, and the men who survived longest were the ones who understood the difference. What happened was that Frank Calabrese was presented with a specific and detailed accounting of what he had done in the previous 10 days. This included the timing of his call to Dante, the Westport documentation that had gone to Benedetto, and the conversations with Carmine. Carmine had quietly documented those and passed them to Dante over dinner. Frank was told clearly and without theater that the accounting had been prepared in triplicate. He was also told that 2 copies were in locations he couldn't access. Frank was then offered a choice. He could leave the organization immediately and completely with enough financial accommodation to make the leaving comfortable, but not enough to make it a reward. Or he could stay and have the accounting become a different kind of conversation with people who were not in the business of accommodation. Frank left. He was in Fort Lauderdale by the following Monday, which Dante knew because Victor Gaines, whose services Dante continued to retain on a month-to-month basis, provided a brief update. Sal D'Amico was a harder conversation and a different kind, because Sal's situation required Dante to sit across from a man he'd known for 18 years and tell him the truth about what Dante had known and when. And the truth was not flattering. Sal had stolen from the organization, and Dante had covered it, and the covering had been a mistake. Not moral exactly, but tactical. The kind of mistake that accumulates interest until the bill arrives all at once. Dante told Sal that the skimming needed to be paid back. In full, over a period, Sal's accountant could structure. He told him that the arrangement they'd had was over, and that going forward the accounting would be transparent in ways it hadn't been before. He told him that the alternative was a severance that would be considerably less comfortable than Frank's. Sal chose to stay. What Dante did not tell Sal, what he told no one, because it was not anyone else's business, was that sitting across from Sal, in that conversation, delivering those terms with the flat, certain authority of a man whose position was not up for discussion, he had been aware of a specific and uncomfortable recognition. He had covered Sal's theft because Sal was useful, because confronting it would have cost him something in the short term, because the calculation of benefit versus inconvenience had come out in favor of looking the other way. He had treated a wrong thing as a manageable thing because managing it was easier than addressing it. He had done the same thing in his marriage, had treated Cordelia as a manageable element of a larger structure rather than a person whose existence in his life had specific moral weight. He did not say this to Sal. He said the necessary things in the necessary order, and the conversation ended, and Sal left. And Dante sat alone in the room for a while before he went back to the work of putting things back together. The federal inquiry, as Marcus Webb had predicted, could not be prevented. What could be managed was its scope, and managing scope was the most expensive legal work Marcus had ever done on Dante's behalf, which meant it was very expensive indeed. The supervising agent, a woman named Harriet Voss, who had been building a case on the margins of Dante's organization for 2 years, and who had received Cordelia's package on a Tuesday morning and spent 48 hours with it before deciding to formally expand her investigation, turned out to be the kind of federal agent who was not susceptible to the various forms of indirect pressure that Dante's network could apply. Not because she was incorruptible in some abstract sense, but because she was specifically immune to the things Dante could offer, which was a different and more practical kind of integrity. Marcus negotiated with her office for 3 weeks. What emerged was not good, but it was survivable. Dante agreed to a cooperation arrangement that required him to provide documentation on 2 external financial structures that were not primarily his. Structures that had been set up by people who were not Dante Moretti and who had, over the years, used Dante's organizational infrastructure in ways that Dante had permitted for a fee and was now prepared to stop permitting. In exchange, the scope of the investigation was bounded in ways that left Dante's core operations reduced, restructured, but present, outside the formal inquiry. Donovan retired early. His name did not appear in any public document. Dante had honored that, not out of loyalty, but because making Donovan's name visible would have narrowed the cooperation deal in ways that cost more than the satisfaction of the alternative. The empire that had taken 20 years to build was smaller when the inquiry closed. It was leaner, quieter, and operated with a transparency it had never had before, which made it less profitable and also considerably harder to touch. Benedetto, who was 67 and genuinely did not want disruption, came back into alignment within 2 weeks, as Carmine had predicted. The other captains followed the direction of whoever held authority with the most stability, which was the fundamental nature of authority in any structure. The organization survived, Dante survived. He stood in the wreckage of the first version of his empire and built a second version from what remained. And the second version was smaller and less glamorous and did not have the particular reputation that had made his name something whispered in certain Boston restaurants. But it was real and it was his, and he had built it this time with a full accounting of what it had cost. 6 months after the wedding, Dante Moretti flew to Florence. He did not tell anyone he was going. He booked the flight under his own name because there was no longer a reason to do otherwise. And he told Marcus he was taking a week of personal travel, and he got on the plane with a carry-on bag and the address that Victor Gaines had sent him 6 months ago, still in his phone, undeleted. He had not decided on the plane what he was going to do when he got there. That was unusual for him. He was a man who decided things before he moved, who understood that movement without decision was the behavior of someone reacting rather than acting. But he was on the plane anyway, heading toward a city he had no other connection to, carrying an address and no plan. And the absence of a plan felt like a different kind of honesty than he was accustomed to. Florence in early spring was not what he expected, which was a useful reminder that most places are not what you expect them to be. It was quieter than he'd imagined. Less touristic in the early months, with a light that fell differently than Boston light. Thinner, older, the kind of light that had been landing on the same stones for long enough that the stones had opinions about it. He found the atelier on Via de Cervi without difficulty. He stood across the street from it for a while. It was a narrow building with tall windows on the second floor, and through the windows he could see the light of a working space. The particular quality of light that exists where people handle old things with new attention. A sign by the door indicated a restoration studio established years before Cordelia had arrived, with business hours and a telephone number. He did not go in. He stood across the street for long enough that the light through the second-floor windows changed as the afternoon moved, and he watched the building the way you watch something when you are trying to decide whether you have the right to approach it. At 4:30, the door opened and Cordelia came out. She was wearing a work apron over dark clothes, and she was pulling the apron off as she stepped onto the street, folding it over her arm. She had a bag on her shoulder. Her hair was shorter than it had been, or maybe it was just that she was wearing it differently, and she was looking at her phone as she came through the door, and then she looked up. She looked up the way you look up when you have the peripheral sense that something has changed in the texture of the space around you. She saw him. She stopped. The street between them was narrow and ordinary. A car moved through it slowly, and then it was quiet again, and they were still looking at each other across 8 feet of old cobblestone. He crossed the street. He stopped 2 feet from her and said nothing, because there was nothing available that would have been adequate as a first thing. He had thought about this on the plane with the focused attention he usually reserved for operational problems, and every version of a first sentence he'd constructed had been insufficient, so he said nothing. Cordelia looked at him. Her face was not the face he'd been carrying in his memory, not frozen, not the face from the wedding or from any specific night across a dinner table. It was moving, alive, doing the thing faces do when a person is processing something that has multiple components and is not yet sure how to organize them. "You have my address," she said. "Yes." "You've had it for 6 months." "Yes." She looked at him for a moment. Then she said, "Are you here to threaten me?" "No." "Are you here for the documentation?" "No." She adjusted the strap of her bag on her shoulder. A small gesture, automatic, the body doing something with its hands while the mind catches up. Then what? He thought about several answers. He discarded them one at a time. What was left at the bottom was the thing he had been carrying for 6 months and had not said to anyone, not Carmine, not Marcus, not to himself clearly enough to put into words until he was standing on a street in Florence, 2 feet from the person it needed to be said to. "I wanted you to know that I understand what I did," he said. "Not what you did in response, what I did, the sequence of it, what it cost you." He paused. "I wanted to say it in person, because saying it on the phone or in writing would have been the version that's designed to manage the situation, and that's not what this is." Cordelia was very still. "I'm not asking for anything," he said. "I'm not asking you to come back. I'm not asking you to withdraw anything or stop anything or give me any version of something I gave up the right to ask for." He met her eyes. "I'm asking you to know that I understood. That's all." The street was quiet. A pigeon landed on the cobblestones nearby, regarded the situation with the complete indifference of a creature unburdened by complexity, and departed. Cordelia looked at him for a long time. When she spoke, her voice was even, and he recognized the evenness of it from 7 days of dinner conversations in Boston. The quality of a woman who is speaking from the considered part of herself rather than the reactive part, who has decided what she is going to say and is saying it from a position of complete steadiness. "I loved you," she said. "That's the thing I spent the most time sitting with afterward, not what you did. The fact that I loved you and it was real, and you knew it was real, and you used it anyway." She paused, not maliciously. That would have been easier. "You used it casually, like it was a resource." He received this without deflecting it. "Yes," he said. "That's accurate." She nodded. Something in her expression shifted, not softened exactly, but changed in the way that acknowledgement sometimes changes things. The weight of a thing becoming slightly different once it has been named clearly by the right person. "How is the organization?" she said. "Smaller," he said. "Cleaner, in some ways, still alive." "And you?" He thought about that. "Older," he said. "Also still alive." Something moved at the corner of her mouth that was not quite a smile, but was in the same neighborhood. "The federal inquiry. Ongoing," he said. "Manageable." "I didn't design it to destroy you," she said. "I want you to know that. Carmine told me. I thought about it for a long time before I believed it. And then I believed it. What changed your mind?" "The fact that you could have," he said, "and the specific ways you chose not to. The press, the public filing. You understood exactly how much damage to do and you stopped there." He paused. "That's not the behavior of someone who wanted the building to burn. I wanted you to have to live in the building after the fire," she said. "That's different." It was different. He knew it was different. Living in the damaged thing. Rebuilding it from the inside with full knowledge of what had brought it down. That was a different punishment from erasure. And it was, he had come to understand, a more honest one. Erasure would have allowed him to become, in his own mind, the victim of someone else's destruction. What she'd done instead required him to be the person who'd caused the conditions that made the destruction possible. "Yes," he said. "That's different." They stood on the street in the thin afternoon light, and the city went on around them with the absolute indifference of very old places. "I'm not going back," Cordelia said. "Not defensive, just clear. I know, and I'm not going to stop what I'm doing here." She glanced briefly at the building behind her. "I have work, real work. The kind I should have been doing all along. I know that too. So why are you here, Dante? Really?" He looked at her. He thought about the answer, and the answer when he found it was simpler than he expected. "Because I spent 20 years building something I thought was permanent." he said. And I needed to stand in front of the one person who proved it wasn't, and say that to her face. Not to change anything, not to get anything back. He paused. Just because some things need to be said in person, to be real. Cordelia looked at him for a long moment. Then she said, okay, just that. Not forgiveness, which he hadn't asked for. Not absolution, which he hadn't expected. Not warmth, which would have been false. Just the simple acknowledgement of a person who has heard something and decided it was what it claimed to be. Take care of yourself, she said. You too, he said. She crossed the street and walked away from him, in the direction of whatever she was going next. And he watched her go for a moment, and then he turned and walked in the other direction, and neither of them looked back. That night, Dante ate alone at a small restaurant near his hotel and had pasta and wine, and watched the other diners with the attention he'd always given to rooms full of people, the habit of reading the architecture of strangers' evenings from the outside. At the table next to him, an old couple ate in the comfortable silence of people who have been together long enough that silence is a form of conversation. They did not perform their ease. It was just there, present, and unremarkable. The way things are when they have been true for long enough that they don't need announcing. He watched them for a while without meaning to. Then he looked at his food and ate it. In her apartment above the atelier, Cordelia made tea and sat at the small desk by the window and looked out at the street that had become hers in the last 6 months. The cobblestones, the lamplight, the sound of the city in a lower key than American cities used. She thought about the conversation. She turned it over the way she turned over the damaged paintings she worked on, looking at it from different angles, assessing what was present and what was lost and what could be recovered and what couldn't. He had come to say what he'd said, and he had meant it, and she had believed him. This was a strange thing to notice, that she still trusted her own read of him even after everything. She thought about the word he'd used, casually. He'd said he'd used her love casually like a resource. She had spent time in the last 6 months choosing the right word for it, and hadn't found one she was completely satisfied with. And he had found it in a street in Florence without preparation, which was either a sign that he'd spent his own time looking for it, or a sign that articulating damage was easier than preventing it. She had not forgiven him. She was not sure forgiveness was the right category for what she'd done with the last 6 months, which was more like the careful process of separating a damaged painting from a bad lining. Slow, precise, trying not to lose any more of the original than had already been lost. She was intact. That was what she had established in Florence, in the work, in the specific daily discipline of a life that was entirely her own. She was intact in the ways that had been threatened and had survived the threat and had come out on the other side, still fundamentally herself, which was not a small thing. It was in fact the only thing that mattered. She picked up the tea. She looked out the window at the lamplight on the cobblestones. Somewhere across the city, in a small restaurant, Dante Moretti was finishing his wine and paying his bill and preparing to return to Boston in the morning to continue the long and expensive and not guaranteed process of rebuilding what remained of his life. And somewhere in Hartford, Patricia Reyes was closing a case file and noting in the margin of the last document that her client had resolved the situation and no further action was required. And in Providence, Marisol was in her studio at 11 at night because Marisol always worked at 11 at night. And she had received a text from a Florence number that said, "Only I'm okay." 2 words, the minimum, exactly what Cordelia would send. And she had sat with it for a moment and then put her phone face down and gone back to the canvas, because that was what you did with the things that were okay. You received them and you held them briefly, and then you went back to your work. The painting in Julia's atelier was coming along. The crack in the panel had been stabilized over 3 weeks. A slow process of humidification and controlled pressure that required more patience than skill, though it required both. The paint layer was next. The losses filled with carefully mixed pigment matched to the original with the kind of attention that meant spending an entire afternoon in front of a single square centimeter and considering it from every angle before touching it. It would not be perfect when it was done. The damage was real and permanent, and no restoration, however skilled, made a thing, as though the damage had not happened. What it did was make the damage legible, visible, but stable, present, but no longer progressing, so that the thing that had been beautiful before the damage could be beautiful again, in a different way, in the way that things are beautiful when they have been broken and repaired by someone who understood what they were looking at. Cordelia knew this. She had always known it. Academically, the way you know things you have studied, she was learning it the other way now. She finished her tea, she went to bed. Outside the city continued its old, indifferent, magnificent life, and the lamplight lay on the cobblestones the way it had for centuries, and the darkness above the roof tiles was full of stars that had nothing at all to do with any of this, and shone anyway.